You are Pope John X. It's 914, and you've just ascended to the throne of St. Peter. You're powerful, intelligent, you command armies, but you have a problem. Marozia, she's the woman who made you Pope, your former lover, but now she's moved on to someone else, and you're trying to break free from her influence, making your own decisions, confronting her. One night she comes to visit you. Let's make peace, she says. She's brought wine. You drink it, and 2 hours later, you're dying. Marozia was the 10th century's most dangerous woman. She killed 3 popes, 2 by poison, 1 by suffocation. She replaced one with her own son, Pope John XI, her child, made him pope at age 20. For 15 years, she controlled the Vatican. Historians call this the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Century. Tonight, I'll tell you about the queen of that dark century. Before diving into one of the most controversial and deliberately suppressed periods in Catholic Church history, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths behind religious institutions and how power actually works behind the scenes, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. And comment below to let me know where you're listening from. This story challenges everything you think you know about the medieval papacy. Let's start with what we know for certain, because this isn't legend or propaganda. It's documented in multiple independent sources, written by people who witnessed these events or interviewed those who did. The period from roughly 904 to 964 CE is known to historians as the Saeculum Obscurum or the Pornocracy, literally meaning rule by prostitutes or the Dark Age. During these 6 decades, the papacy was controlled not by cardinals or emperors, but by 3 women from a single powerful Roman family: Theodora the Elder, her daughter Marozia, and Marozia's daughter Theodora the Younger. Of these 3, Marozia was the most powerful, the most ruthless, and the most successful at eliminating anyone who threatened her control. She was born around 890 in Rome to Theophylact, a wealthy Roman senator and consul, and his wife Theodora. Her family was already powerful, controlling much of Rome's civic administration and having significant influence over church politics. But Marozia would take that influence to levels her parents could never have imagined. The story begins when Marozia was approximately 15 years old. Pope Sergius III, who had just violently seized the papal throne in 904 by deposing and murdering his predecessor, noticed the beautiful teenage daughter of one of Rome's most powerful families. What happened next is recorded by multiple contemporary historians, though they describe it with varying degrees of disapproval. Sergius III took Marozia as his mistress. She was 15. He was in his 50s. This wasn't a secret affair. It was conducted openly, with Marozia essentially living in the Lateran Palace as the Pope's concubine. In 911, she gave birth to a son. The father was almost certainly Sergius III, though this was never officially acknowledged. That son was named John, and he would later become Pope John XI, making him quite possibly the only person in history to be born as the illegitimate son of a pope and then become pope himself. But Marozia's relationship with Sergius III was about more than sex or even producing a future pope. It was her education in power. She learned how the papal court functioned, who the key players were, where the money came from, and most importantly, how vulnerable the position of pope actually was. Despite all the religious authority, despite the claim to be Christ's representative on earth, the pope was just a man, and men could be manipulated, used, and if necessary, eliminated. Pope Sergius III died in 911, when Marozia was about 21. The cause of death was officially recorded as natural. He was elderly and had been in poor health, but Marozia was with him when he died, and some historians have speculated that she may have hastened his end, perhaps to prevent him from acknowledging their son, or to free herself to pursue other alliances. We'll never know for certain, but it set a pattern that would repeat throughout her life. Men who were useful to Marozia lived. Men who became obstacles died. After Sergius III's death, the papacy went to Anastasius III, then to Lando, then to John X. These popes were elected with significant influence from Marozia's family, but they weren't entirely under her control. John X, in particular, proved to be independent-minded and powerful in his own right. He was an effective administrator and military leader, successfully defending Rome against Saracen invasions. For several years, there was an uneasy balance. John X ruled the church, while Marozia and her family controlled much of Rome's secular government. But Marozia wanted more than influence. She wanted complete control, and John X was becoming a problem. He was making alliances with other Italian powers that didn't include her family. He was appointing cardinals who weren't loyal to her. He was, in essence, trying to be an actual independent pope rather than a puppet. This could not be allowed. The exact method of Pope John X's death in 928 is disputed by historians, but all sources agree on several key facts. He was forcibly deposed and imprisoned. Marozia's family was directly responsible, and he died shortly afterward in suspicious circumstances. Some sources say he was smothered with a pillow. Others suggest he was strangled. A few claim he was poisoned. What's clear is that a sitting pope was murdered by the family of his his predecessor's mistress, and no one could stop it because that family controlled Rome's military forces. Let's pause here to understand the mechanics of how Marozia accumulated and wielded power, because it's more sophisticated than simple murder. She was married 3 times, and each marriage was a calculated political move. Her first husband was Alberic I of Spoleto, a powerful Italian nobleman who controlled territory near Rome. This marriage gave her military backing and legitimacy beyond just her father's Roman power base. When Alberic died, some say conveniently, she married Guy of Tuscany, who controlled even more territory and military forces. After Guy's death, she married Hugh of Italy, who was king of Italy and one of the most powerful rulers in the region. Through these marriages, Marozia assembled a network of military and political power that made her effectively untouchable in Rome. The papacy, which had no army of its own and depended on the support of Roman noble families, was completely at her mercy. She could make or break popes, and everyone knew it. This is why she could murder Pope John X with impunity. Who was going to stop her? The cardinals were terrified of her. The Roman people depended on her family for grain and security. Foreign powers were either allied with her through marriage or too distant to intervene. After John X murder in 928, Marozia installed 2 puppet popes in quick succession, Leo VI and Stephen VII. Both reigned less than 2 years each, both were completely subservient to Marozia, and both died of natural causes while still relatively young. The pattern should be obvious. These popes served Marozia's interests, approved the appointments she wanted, and made no independent decisions. When they proved unnecessary or potentially troublesome, they died and were replaced. Then in 931, Marozia made her boldest move yet. She installed her own son, John, as Pope John XI. He was approximately 20 years old, possibly the youngest pope in history up to that point. And crucially, everyone knew he was Marozia's son, quite possibly the illegitimate offspring of Pope Sergius III. The symbolism was unmistakable. Marozia wasn't just controlling the papacy from behind the scenes anymore. She had placed her own blood on the throne of St. Peter. Pope John XI was entirely his mother's creature. He made no decisions without her approval. Cardinals who wanted anything had to go through Marozia. Appointments, dispensations, political alliances, everything flowed through her. She had achieved something unprecedented in church history: de facto female rule over the papacy in an institution that officially barred women from any position of authority. But let's talk about the methods. How exactly did Marozia kill popes without getting caught? The answer lies in understanding medieval poisoning techniques and the medical knowledge of the time. The 2 most likely poisons she would have used were arsenic and various plant-based toxins like hemlock or nightshade derivatives. Arsenic was particularly useful because it could be administered in small doses over time, producing symptoms that looked like natural illness. The victim would experience nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and gradual weakening, all of which could be attributed to various common illnesses of the era. Medieval physicians had no way to test for poison, so if someone showed these symptoms and eventually died, it would be recorded as natural death from illness. The key was access and trust. As a member of the most powerful family in Rome and a former lover of at least one pope, Marozia had regular access to the papal apartments. She could visit popes privately. She could send food or wine as gifts. She could ensure that servants loyal to her were placed in key positions in the papal household. Once that access was established, poisoning became relatively easy. Contemporary chronicles give us some clues about the specific circumstances of papal deaths during this period. Pope John X was said to have been overcome by sudden illness after meeting with representatives of Marozia's family. Pope Leo VI died after less than 8 months in office, with chronicles noting he was struck down by fever. Pope Stephen VII lasted even less time and was said to have suffered from stomach ailments. These vague descriptions are exactly what you'd expect if arsenic poisoning was being misdiagnosed as natural illness. But Marozia wasn't just a poisoner. She was also willing to use more direct violence when necessary. When Pope John X proved too difficult to poison or when speed was essential, she apparently ordered him smothered or strangled in his prison cell after deposing him. This kind of crude violence was riskier because it was harder to disguise as natural death, but it was also certain and quick. The psychological dimension of Marozia's power is worth examining. She ruled through fear as much as through actual violence. Popes and cardinals knew what had happened to John X. They knew that Leo VI and Stephen VII had died suspiciously young. They knew that Marozia could reach them in their own apartments, that their food could be poisoned, that servants could be bribed or threatened. This created an atmosphere of constant terror that made rebellion almost impossible. Even those who wanted to resist Marozia were paralyzed by fear of ending up like John X. Pope John XI reigned for nearly 8 years under his mother's control. During this time, the papacy was effectively a department of Marozia's family government. The spiritual leader of Western Christianity was a puppet who did his mother's bidding. It was the absolute nadir of papal authority and dignity, a complete inversion of what the office was supposed to represent. But Marozia's power began to crumble in a way she couldn't have anticipated. In 932, she married Hugh of Italy, who was already king of Italy and one of the most powerful men in the region. The marriage seemed like a brilliant move. It would combine her control of Rome and the papacy with Hugh's control of northern Italy, potentially creating a unified Italian kingdom under their joint rule. However, Marozia had a son from her first marriage, Alberic II. He was now a young man in his early 20s, ambitious and resentful of his mother's new husband. Hugh apparently treated Alberic with contempt, reportedly slapping him publicly at the wedding feast. This humiliation of the son of Rome's most powerful woman proved to be a catastrophic mistake. Alberic II organized a revolt against his mother and stepfather. He rallied Roman nobles who were tired of being ruled by Marozia and who feared that Hugh's arrival would mean even more external control over Rome. In 932, Alberic's forces stormed the Castel Sant'Angelo, where Marozia and Hugh were residing. Hugh managed to escape by climbing down the fortress walls on ropes, but Marozia was captured by her own son. Alberic II imprisoned his mother in the Castel Sant'Angelo, the same fortress from which she had ruled Rome. She would spend the rest of her life there, approximately 12 years, dying around 954. Her son allowed her to live but stripped her of all power. Her puppet pope, John XI, who was Alberic's half-brother, was also imprisoned and controlled by Alberic, though he was allowed to continue performing religious ceremonies under guard. This is where Marozia's story ends, but the story of female control over the papacy continued. Her daughter, also named Theodora, would eventually exert significant influence over the papacy in the following generation, though never with the same absolute power her mother had wielded. The Saeculum Obscurum continued until Otto I, the Holy Roman Emperor, intervened in the 960s and imposed reforms that restored some measure of dignity and independence to the papal office. Now let's address the historical controversy around this period. The Catholic Church has, for obvious reasons, preferred not to emphasize this era of its history. The idea that the papacy was controlled by a woman who murdered at least 2 popes, possibly 3, and installed her own possibly illegitimate son as pope doesn't fit well with narratives about apostolic succession and divine guidance of the Church. Some Catholic historians have tried to minimize or deny the extent of Marozia's power and crimes. They argue that the sources describing her as a murderous tyrant were written by her enemies or by Protestant polemicists centuries later who wanted to discredit the papacy. They suggest that while Marozia was certainly influential, she wasn't actually killing popes. That's just hostile propaganda. However, this revisionist view doesn't hold up well against the evidence. The contemporary sources describing Marozia's power and the suspicious deaths of popes weren't written by later Protestants. They were written by Catholic chroniclers during or shortly after the Saeculum Obscurum. Liutprand of Cremona, one of our main sources, was a Catholic bishop who had no reason to invent stories that made the Church look bad. He was simply recording what everyone in Rome knew but didn't dare speak openly about while Marozia was alive. The pattern of papal deaths during Marozia's period of influence is also telling. Between 904 and 963, there were 24 popes, an average reign of less than 2.5 years each. Many died young or in suspicious circumstances. This mortality rate is much higher than in the centuries before or after, suggesting that something unusual was happening. While not all these deaths can be attributed to Marozia, some occurred before her time or after her imprisonment. The concentration of suspicious deaths during her peak power years, 914 to 932, is striking. We should also consider what Marozia's story tells us about power, gender, and institutions. Here was a woman who lived in a thoroughly patriarchal society and institution. The medieval church officially taught that women were inferior to men and barred from any position of religious authority. Yet Marozia managed to accumulate and wield more power than virtually any woman of her era. How? First, she leveraged her sexuality strategically. Her relationship with Pope Sergius III gave her initial access and knowledge. Her marriages to powerful noblemen gave her military backing. She understood that in a society that wouldn't give women formal power, informal power through relationships with powerful men could be just as effective. Second, she was willing to use violence in ways that men found shocking precisely because she was a woman. Medieval society expected men to be violent. That was normal. But a woman who poisoned popes and ordered murders challenged fundamental assumptions about gender. This psychological dissonance may have actually worked in her favor, paralyzing potential opponents who couldn't quite process what they were facing. Third, she filled a power vacuum. The early 10th century was a period of extreme weakness for central authority in Italy. The Carolingian Empire had collapsed, the Holy Roman Empire hadn't yet been revived, and Italy was fragmented among competing noble families families, and city-states. In this chaotic environment, whoever controlled Rome and the papacy had enormous influence, and Marozia's family happened to be in the right place at the right time. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, she was simply more ruthless than her opponents. She was willing to kill popes. Most people, even ambitious and unscrupulous people, would balk at murdering the supposed vicar of Christ. But Marozia had seen behind the curtain. She knew popes were just men, that the office was political, and that anyone who controlled Rome could control who sat on Peter's throne. This clear-eyed understanding of power, unencumbered by religious sentimentality, gave her an enormous advantage. Let's return to the question of whether this story is true, because it's so outrageous that skepticism is warranted. Could a woman really have poisoned multiple popes and gotten away with it? Could the Catholic Church really have been controlled for decades by a woman and her family? Isn't this just anti-Catholic propaganda? The evidence strongly suggests it's true. We have multiple independent contemporary sources. We have the undeniable historical fact that during this period, popes died at unusual rates and were often succeeded by popes chosen by Marozia's family. We have the documented case of Pope John XI, whose maternity by Marozia was never seriously disputed. We have Alberic II's revolt against his mother, which only makes sense if she actually had the power contemporary sources describe. And we have the Church's own admission that this period, the Saeculum Obscurum, was a time of exceptional corruption and worldliness in the papacy. What we can debate is the exact body count. Did Marozia personally poison 3 popes, or 2, or 1? Did some of the papal deaths during her era result from natural causes or other conspiracies? These details are uncertain, but the basic outline, that Marozia controlled the papacy for years, that popes who opposed her died under suspicious circumstances, and that she installed her own son as pope, is as well established as any fact from the medieval period can be. The story raises uncomfortable questions about institutional corruption and how it perpetuates itself. The Catholic Church claims an unbroken apostolic succession, a direct line of legitimate authority from St. Peter to the current pope. But what does that mean when several links in that chain were murdered puppets controlled by a woman who was herself morally bankrupt? Does Pope John XI consecration of bishops and ordination of priests count if he was only pope because his mother murdered his predecessors? These are questions the Church has never satisfactorily answered, preferring to simply move on from this embarrassing period. Marozia spent her last years imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo, the circular fortress built as Emperor Hadrian's mausoleum that had become a papal stronghold. For a woman who had controlled popes and wielded power over Western Christianity, being locked up by her own son must have been a bitter end. We don't know if she felt remorse for the murders she ordered. Medieval sources give us no insight into her psychology or emotional state during those final years. She died around 954, probably in her early 60s. There was no grand funeral, no memorial, no attempt to honor her memory. She simply disappeared from history, her death recorded in a few brief chronicle entries. Her son Alberic II, who had overthrown her, ruled Rome until his own death in 954, just months after his mother. Before dying, he made the Roman nobles swear that his son Octavian would be elected pope when the current pope died. They kept that promise, and Octavian became Pope John XII in 955, at approximately age 18. Pope John XII proved to be nearly as corrupt as his grandmother Marozia. He turned the Lateran palace into what one chronicle called a brothel. He was accused of murder, adultery, and sacrilege. He died at age 27, reportedly killed by the jealous husband of a woman he was sleeping with. The family's corruption continued. The Saeculum Obscurum finally ended when Otto I, King of Germany and later Holy Roman Emperor, intervened forcefully in papal politics in the 960s. He deposed Pope John XII and ensured that subsequent popes were chosen with imperial approval and had at least minimal qualifications for the office. It took outside military force to break the cycle of corruption that Marozia and her family had established. What lessons can we draw from Marozia's story? First, that institutions are only as strong as the people running them and the systems that check abuse. The papacy had enormous theoretical authority as Christ's representative on earth, but that meant nothing when the people around the Pope were willing to murder him and install a puppet. All the religious dignity and apostolic succession in the world couldn't protect the office when those who controlled Rome's temporal power decided to treat it as a political prize. Second, that formal rules about who can hold power are less important than informal access to violence and wealth. The Catholic Church officially barred women from all positions of authority, but that didn't stop Marozia from controlling the papacy for 15 years, because she controlled the armies and money that the papacy depended on. Gender barriers, like all formal rules, only matter if someone is willing and able to enforce them. Third, that corruption feeds on secrecy and fear. Marozia's power lasted as long as it did because no one dared speak openly about what was happening. Popes were dying, everyone knew something was wrong, but actually accusing accusing Marozia of murder would mean becoming her next target. Only when her own son turned against her, someone who knew her methods and had military force of his own, could her reign end. Fourth, that the past was weirder and messier than we usually imagine. We tend to think of medieval Christianity as a time of simple faith and clear morality, but the reality was that even the church's highest office could be controlled by a serial killer, that popes could be murdered and replaced like pieces on a chessboard, and that everyone involved would continue going through religious motions while knowing it was all corrupt. Human nature doesn't change as much as we'd like to think. Marozia deserves to be remembered not as a monster or as a feminist icon, but as what she actually was, a ruthless operator in a ruthless age who understood power better than most of her contemporaries. She saw that the papacy, despite all its religious pretensions, was a political office that could be controlled through the same means as any other political office: violence, bribery, and strategic alliances. She was willing to do things that others weren't, including murdering popes, and that willingness gave her power. But she was also ultimately limited by the same systems that enabled her rise. She could control popes, but she couldn't make herself pope because she was a woman. She could rule through sons and lovers, but that meant depending on men who might turn against her, as her son Alberic eventually did. She achieved extraordinary power within a patriarchal system, but she could never fully transcend that system's limitations. The Catholic Church would prefer you didn't know about Marozia. She doesn't appear in most popular church histories. When the Saeculum Obscurum is mentioned at all, it's usually glossed over quickly as a period of corruption, without details about what that corruption actually entailed. This is understandable. It's embarrassing to admit that multiple popes were probably murdered by the same woman, that another pope was her illegitimate son, and that for years the spiritual leadership of Western Christianity was effectively run by someone the church's own doctrine said couldn't hold any religious office. But Marozia's story is part of history, and it's a story worth knowing. It reminds us that religious institutions, despite claims to divine guidance, are run by humans with human motives and human weaknesses. It shows us that even in the most patriarchal societies, exceptional individuals could find ways to accumulate and wield power. And it demonstrates that corruption, once established, can perpetuate itself for decades until outside force breaks the cycle. The woman who poisoned popes died in a prison cell, her power broken, her reputation destroyed, her memory deliberately obscured by the institution she once controlled. But she had her moment. For 15 years, the most powerful religious office in Western Christianity belonged to her. Popes lived or died by her will. Cardinals trembled at her name. And though the church tried to forget her, the chronicles remember. Marozia, the senatrix of Rome, the woman who made and destroyed popes, the dark queen of the dark century. Remember her story. Remember that power doesn't always look the way we expect. Remember that institutions can be captured by determined individuals willing to do what others won't. And remember that the past is always more complex, more human, and more disturbing than the sanitized versions we usually get. The wine was poisoned. The Pope is dead. And for a brief moment in the 10th century, a woman ruled the church that said women couldn't rule. That's history. That's human nature. That's power.